Nora Bennett had exactly 4 minutes left before she needed to leave the community center parking lot. And she would spend the rest of her life grateful that for small girls and soccer cleats decided, in those 4 minutes, that her arm was more interesting than the ice cream truck idling 20 feet away. What Nora didn't know, crouching down to retie a shoelace for a child who wasn't hers, was that the tiny constellation of stars tattooed along her wrist was about to unravel 11 years of a story she had spent over a decade trying not to think about, a story that started with a promise made at 23 and ended, she'd always believed, the day she watched the only man she'd ever fully trusted walk out of a hospital waiting room and never call her again. She had no idea his daughters were standing in front of her. She had no idea, in fact, that he had daughters at all. The oldest of the 4 girls, a serious 7-year-old named Uni, with her father's exact skeptical eyebrows, was the one who noticed at first the small cluster of 5 stars inked along the inside of Nora's wrist, positioned in the specific asymmetrical pattern that most people would assume was random, and that Uni, without knowing why, recognized instantly, because she had fallen asleep more nights, and she could count tracing an identical pattern on her own father's forearm while he read her bedtime stories. The 2 of them alone, in a house that had been missing a mother for going on 2 years, Jonah said. With the flat, unfiltered certainty children have about facts, adults spend years learning to complicate. Our dad has that exact same tattoo. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness has no rank and grace wears no uniform, please like this video, subscribe to The Overlooked, and share this with someone who needs to believe in people again today. Nora Bennett had gotten that tattoo at 23, in a cramped shop above a laundromat, sitting in a chair beside a man named Caleb Hart while they both winced through the same 15 minutes of needlework. A matching set of 5 stars, representing the exact constellation visible from the roof of the apartment building where they had spent the better part of 2 years falling in love, a relationship that had felt, at the time, permanent in the specific, unguarded way only young love manages to feel before life has had the chance to prove otherwise. They had talked about marriage. They had picked out, half jokingly and half not, names for children they weren't planning yet, but somehow already loved in the abstract. And then, 6 months after the tattoos, Nora's mother had a stroke 3 states away, and Nora had left within the week to care for her, certain the distance was temporary, certain that whatever they had was strong enough to survive a few months apart. It hadn't been. Not because either of them stopped loving the other, but because of the specific slow erosion that happens to long-distance relationships conducted, mostly through phone calls that get shorter and less frequent as new lives quietly reassemble themselves around to people trying, and eventually failing, to hold on to an old one. Caleb had stopped calling first, or Nora had stopped answering first, even now, over a decade later. She genuinely could not remember who had actually let go, only that by the time she moved back, 18 months later, he had already met someone else, and pride and hurt and the particular exhausting logistics of reopening a wound she'd only just finished closing had kept her from ever reaching out to find out what might have still been possible. She had married someone else 4 years later. It had ended in divorce 3 years after that, quietly, without drama. 2 people who had built a life together out of practicality, more than the kind of consuming love she still, on certain nights, remembered feeling on that rooftop with Caleb. She had no children from that marriage. She had built, in the years since, a steady, contained life as a pediatric physical therapist. The kind of life that looked complete from the outside and felt, most days, like something she'd settled into rather than chosen. What Nora did not know, kneeling in that parking lot with 4 girls staring at her wrist, was that Caleb Hart's life had unraveled in ways considerably more devastating than her own. He had married a woman named Elise 2 years after Nora left, and they'd had, over the following 6 years, the 4 daughters currently surrounding Nora's wrist with the specific total fascination only very young children can summon for something slightly forbidden. Uni, and her younger triplet sisters Ren, Poppy, and Sage. Born 2 years after Uni, in a delivery that had nearly cost Elise her life and had, in the years since, left her with a heart condition that finally, catastrophically, caught up with her 14 months before this parking lot. On an ordinary Tuesday evening while she was making dinner, in front of all 4 of her daughters, in a way none of them had fully processed even now, Caleb had spent the 14 months since Elise's death in the specific, chaotic survival mode of a single father raising 4 young girls entirely alone. No extended family nearby. A job in structural engineering that he'd had to restructure almost entirely around school pickups and pediatrician appointments, and the particular, unglamorous logistics of 4 small people who needed him for absolutely everything. He had gotten very good in those 14 months at holding the pieces of his family together in public and falling apart. Briefly and privately, in the 15 minutes after the girls were finally asleep, he had not dated. He had not, if he was honest with himself, fully grieved either, not Elise, whose death he was still learning to carry, and not in some older, unexamined corner of himself. The version of his life he'd once imagined with Nora Bennett, a version he'd told himself for over a decade he'd stopped thinking about, right up until this exact Saturday when he was 15 feet away at the snack table, unaware that his daughters had just found the one person on earth capable of unraveling both griefs at once. The dark part of what happened next unfolded fast. In the chaotic, unplanned way, real reunions rarely resemble the tidy version people imagine. Uni, delighted by her discovery, did not think to consider whether announcing it might be complicated. She simply grabbed her sister Ren's hand and ran the 15 feet to the snack table, breathless, and said, loudly enough that 3 nearby parents turned to look, Dad, there's a lady with your tattoo." Caleb Hart turned around, already smiling the reflexive, tired smile he'd perfected for whatever chaos his daughters had found this time. And the smile did not survive contact with what he actually saw, which was Nora Bennett, 11 years older, hair shorter, still crouched in the parking lot with his 4 daughters around her, looking up at him with an expression that mirrored, almost exactly, the frozen disbelief moving across his own face. Neither of them spoke for what felt, to both of them independently, like an unbearably long time. Uni, oblivious to the seismic quality of the silence she'd just created, said, "See? Same one." 5 stars, and pointed between the 2 adults. With the simple satisfaction of a child who has successfully solved a puzzle and has no idea the puzzle was ever anything more complicated than matching ink. Nora stood up slowly. She said, "Caleb," and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Caleb," said Nora. He looked at his daughters, then back at her, visibly trying to reassemble an entire decade of assumptions in real time. These are my girls," Nora said. "I didn't know you had kids." She heard how strange the sentence sounded even as she said it. The enormous understatement of 11 years of not knowing anything about each other's lives compressed into 5 plain words. What followed over the next several weeks was not, despite what either of them might once have imagined a reunion like this could feel like, simple or clean. Caleb was still, by any honest accounting, in the early and unpredictable stages of grief, capable on any given day of feeling ready to let someone new into his family's fragile routine, and equally capable, on the very next day, of a guilt so sharp it felt like betrayal simply to feel something warm toward another woman while his daughters were still learning to say their mother's name without their voices breaking. Nora, for her part, carried her own complicated wreckage, not just the old wound of how things had ended with Caleb, but a newer fear that had built quietly over her failed marriage, the fear that she was fundamentally someone people left, a fear that for instantly attached little girls and their still grieving father represented either the exact wrong moment to test that fear, or, terrifyingly, the only chance she'd get to prove it wrong. They tried, cautiously, to simply be friends first, meeting for coffee twice, both of them talking around the actual size of what had reawakened between them. Both of them privately terrified of moving too fast into a household still raw with loss. It nearly fell apart entirely on the 3rd meeting. 6 weeks in, when Sage, the shyest of the triplets, asked Nora during a shared afternoon at the park whether she was going to be their new mommy. A question asked with total 4-year-old innocence that landed on both adults like an explosion neither had been prepared for. Caleb, panicking, said too quickly and too harshly that things were complicated. That Nora was just a friend, a correction that came out sharper than he intended, and left Nora quietly, thoroughly hurt in a way that took her 3 days and a difficult phone call to fully explain to him. That being reduced to just a friend in front of his daughter, after everything the last 6 weeks had actually been between them, felt like exactly the kind of dismissal she'd spent her whole adult life bracing herself to receive. Caleb, hearing the hurt in her voice on that call, said quietly, "I panicked. I'm sorry. I think some part of me is terrified that if I let this be real and it goes wrong, I'm not just losing you. I'm watching my daughters lose someone else. And I don't know if I can survive putting them through that twice." Nora was quiet for a long moment. She said, "I understand that fear better than you'd think. But you can't protect them from ever loving anyone again just because loving people is risky. That's not protection. That's just a different kind of loss you're choosing for them instead." Something in that reframing reached him in a way little else had over the previous 14 months. He drove to her apartment that same evening, an unplanned, slightly reckless decision that surprised even him, and told her, standing in her doorway, that he did not have this figured out, that grief and fear, and for small girls who deserved a father who chose carefully rather than quickly, made this enormously complicated, but that he was done pretending the last 6 weeks had been nothing, because they hadn't been nothing to him. Not for a single day of it. It took another 8 months of slow, deliberate introductions, of family therapy sessions Caleb insisted on for all 5 of them together, of Nora earning trust with the girls, not through grand gestures but through the accumulated small reliability of showing up consistently, week after week. Exactly the kind of steady presence she had once feared she was incapable of being. Before the 5 of them functioned as anything resembling a family, there were setbacks. Wren, working through her own version of grief, went through a difficult stretch of open hostility toward Nora that took months of patient, ungrudging presence to soften. Nora herself nearly walked away once, overwhelmed by the size of what she'd stepped into, before deciding, after a long night of genuinely considering leaving, that the fear of failing at something enormous was not a good enough reason to refuse to try it. On the day, Caleb finally asked Nora to marry him. A small, quiet proposal in the same apartment building where they'd gotten their matching tattoos over a decade earlier, now home to a coffee shop instead of the laundromat that used to sit beneath it. All 4 girls were there, having helped him plan it in the specific chaotic, overly enthusiastic way for young girls help plan anything. Uni, now 8, stood at the front holding a small, hand-drawn sign that read, in determined 7-year-old handwriting corrected by her sister, "Will you be our mom now?" The sentence that had once nearly ended things between them 6 months earlier, now offered freely, joyfully, as the invitation it had always secretly wanted to be. Nora, crying too hard to speak for a full minute, eventually said yes to all 5 of them at once, and Caleb, holding her hands in the same building where an entirely different version of this exact moment had once seemed guaranteed, and then, for 11 long years. "Impossible," said quietly, just for her. "I think some part of me never actually stopped waiting for you. I just didn't know it until Uni found the stars." If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to The Overlooked for more stories of courage, grace, and the small human moments that change everything. And tell us in the comments, do you believe some people are simply meant to find their way back to each other, no matter how long it takes?